everybody, this is Katya Eckhart. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This evening I'm wearing my orange outfit, so I'm going to kind of jazz it up a little bit this evening. And what I want to do is conclude my latest round of theological comments so that I can move on to some new things, hopefully in future videos. What I want to do is very briefly revisit this Nietzschean critique of these two different theologies that I was discussing during the last couple of videos or so, and then I want to explain how that critique does not apply to the new theological position that I developed, this kind of Kierkegaardian position that I described several videos ago. So let me just begin by reviewing the critique that I was talking about, Nietzschean critique, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I'm just going to sort of hit the high points. So let's remember the first theology, the theology of Gelassenheit. So the Nietzschean critique basically is saying that the experiences and some of the presuppositions on which this theology bases itself can be interpreted in a different way without any kind of theological or religious meaning. So let's just remember a couple of examples. One is that the Gelassenheit theologian, where Gelassenheit is this notion of letting be, it's a kind of energized tranquility that's supposed to be our fundamental experience of God, and that when we become aware of certain changes, it's supposed to help us decide whether to accept those changes or not, depending on whether or not we have this full experience. So one thing that presupposes is that there is a stable, for example, if I'm trying to make that decision, there's a stable I, or in German Ich, there's a stable agent or a self that's sort of confronting these changes and then is trying to make a decision. Well, without getting into a lot of the specifics this evening, Nietzsche thinks that the whole idea of an Ich or a self, a sort of fixed agent, as opposed to a kind of flux of conscious experience, he thinks that that is a mistake, or at least he provides an interpretation of our experiences whereby it could come to seem that there is this kind of stable self that's supposed to be making decisions, but in fact there really isn't. So he raises a counter possibility that undermines that interpretation of the experience. That's one thing. Another thing that he does is, or suggests, is that the idea of this notion of a kind of trackle clock, this object that, something that I can revisit from time to time, and so that enables me to become aware of various changes that have happened or that might happen. That supposes that this object, this stable object, really is that there is something that sort of persists through time, and Nietzsche thinks that that also can be given a different interpretation. In other words, we can provide a way of interpreting our experiences so that it seems to us that there are these stable things that we could use as kind of a measure, but really, in fact, that's not the case, or it might not be the case. What if it weren't the case? Here's another way of looking at it, Nietzsche would say, and if that's the case, then there's no such thing as a trackle clock. There's no such thing as a stable measure that we could use to look at, become aware of possible changes or maybe actual changes so that we could decide what to do about them. Another thing that I left out, but it's equally important, is that when we're making these decisions, it seems pretty apparent that, well, some of them are supposed to be the good ones and some of them the bad ones, or maybe a particular change. I should accept it if it's a good change, right? Or I should not accept it if it's a bad change. Well, for Nietzsche, this presupposes the whole moral framework of good and bad, or good and evil, and he thinks that that also is something that really is an artifact of our interpretation and our projection. It's not something that's a given, it's something that is an artifact of that, along with the notion of a stable self and a stable external measure. That's an artifact of our interpretation. It's not something that we have to think. And so if we don't have to think it, then that means we don't have to go down this particular theological path. Finally, we saw that according to the Nietzschean critique, the Gelassenheit theologian, sort of what happens is that there's this, or at least there could be, what starts out as an internal experience of sort of energized tranquility or Gelassenheit, from which flow all kind of beneficial behaviors, but then the theologian sort of switches that around and starts treating Gelassenheit not only as something out there, as opposed to something inside of us, but as an effect, as opposed to being a cause. So that when we put ourselves in a position where we have this stable measure and we become aware of these changes, and then we decide what to do about them, and then if it causes us to feel Gelassenheit or for us to have this experience, well then Gelassenheit is being treated as an effect as opposed to a cause, and he thinks that that's a confusion, or at least that he's providing an alternative interpretation of all this stuff that doesn't really point in any theological direction. Instead, it just has to do with all these confusions and juxtapositions and interpretations that we've come up with. So that's one target of the critique. Now the other target of the critique is the strike theology, which identifies our fundamental experience of divinity as one of struggling to wrest some kind of clarity from it, which is this kind of enigma. And the strike theologian, remember, the key experience is this notion of anxiety in the face of the uncanny. So that when we get to the end of all the ontological conditions that are available to us, we still feel anxiety because there's something uncanny that transcends them, that's not identical with any one of them, and yet we are having to make a decision about that we don't know how to make. And then the strike theologian comes up with various ways in which we might try to get around that difficulty that I discussed a little bit earlier. Now, in some ways, this position makes some progress over the other one because it doesn't really treat the self as a given. It's something that I didn't really say that much about last time, but for the strike theologian, the self is not a given, it's an accomplishment. It's something that we have to gain when we finally figure out how to make this decision about the passing by of divinity, or the passing by of the last God, as Martin Heidegger calls it. But the self is not given. And also, there's no apparatus of trackle clocks or some kind of stable measure that's supposed to help us become aware of actual and possible changes that we hold up for decision. All of that's left behind by the strike theologian, so there's some progress there. And also, the whole moral framework of good and bad, that's also set aside by the strike theologian, because he wants to say, or the theologian wants to say, that the way we become perfect on this theological approach is not by being morally perfect or fulfilling every conceivable moral requirement, which I've suggested in earlier videos is not something we can do because of moral dilemmas, at least the possibility of them. It's that we're supposed to make this leap into this powerful experience of the holy or of God, and that's what perfection will be. Not a moral kind of perfection, but something that transcends that. So there are ways in which that second theological approach avoids the Gelassenheit problems, the problems with Gelassenheit theology. But there still is this problem, this other issue, and that is, Nietzsche would say, well look, there's another way of interpreting the whole experience of anxiety. What if that experience started out, what we were anxious about is the possibility of an untimely demise of ourselves, of our society, and the fact that we don't have any rules or we don't have any conventions to prevent that. So that's what anxiety was originally about. That acted as a cause to make us come up with a bunch of rules or conventions for dealing with various contingencies, which work pretty well, and that causes us to adhere to them so that we can protect ourselves. And now that's happened. Whereupon we forget about all that stuff, and the notion of anxiety is still floating out there without any kind of anchor. So then, what if we still are aware of this feeling of anxiety, and because we don't like uncomfortable feelings, we want to find some other kind of cause of it, and now, once again, we get things backwards. In other words, we start treating anxiety as an effect of the fact that we have fulfilled all these conditions, and yet we still feel that there's something uncanny, whereas previously it was a cause of why we fulfilled all these conditions. Now it's an effect of that, and we say, oh, it must be about something out there that's divine, that transcends everything, but that's just an artifact of our own confusion, or what if it were? Here's an alternative interpretation of all that stuff that doesn't have any kind of theological consequence. So that's what the Nietzschean critique is. Now, very briefly, what about this Kierkegaardian view that I have been defending in earlier videos? I don't think that that's vulnerable to the same critique. So why not? Well, let's go back. One thing is that there's nothing in the Kierkegaardian position that I've developed that says anything about, well, you know, there's a stable I that's making decisions. No, we have to make a leap, right? In other words, whether we attain genuine selfhood before God or not is not something that's a given. So, in that way, the Kierkegaardian view does not share this presupposition with Gelassenheit theology, nor does it make any appeal to some kind of stable measure like a Traco clock or things that we might return to out in the world that could act as a sort of stable measure that would enable us to become aware of changes and so forth. No, there's nothing like that. We don't really need any of that. The only thing that's in play is how we choose to feel in response to what God has done in Christ. Remember, the basic idea is that God becomes a human being who suffers and dies this horrendous death and then rises from the dead. But then the purpose of going through all of that is to make us feel sorrow about the suffering of this innocent victim. And then depending on how when we step back and react to our own sorrow about that and the fact that God is causing us to feel that way, do we feel outraged about that or indifferent, in which case we can't share in eternal blessedness with the risen Christ? Or do we feel gratitude about the sorrow, in which case any sins that we've committed or our inability to be perfectly moral, that is sort of counterbalanced by the fact that we do have this sorrow, which is a kind of pain, that sort of offsets any sins that we've committed, and it also enables us, when we do that, and we enter into this union with God, we are the author of that. We are the one who, in some sense, whether God is something good for us comes down to us. And so we then attain this kind of perfection without going through any kind of moral, any kind of moral rules or anything like that. So on that front, it seems to me the Kierkegaardian view is not vulnerable to this sort of objection that, well, it's assuming morality. No, it's not. It's moving beyond that. Finally, what about the charge that human beings often confuse causes and effects? Well, in the Kierkegaardian view that I described, remember that it's very central to that whether God is good or bad with respect to me, that comes down to how I choose to react to God. Even whether God is actual or not for me, that comes down to how I choose to respond to certain stories that I read about in the Bible or that maybe I hear. And if I have a very powerful feeling of being inspired by that, as I've explained before, that plays into this sort of threefold divinity, tripartite divinity, this Trinitarian structure that makes it actual for me. Now, who's the cause here and who's the effect? It may not be entirely clear, because on the one hand, it is the case that whether God is actual for me and whether God is something good for me, that's going to come down to how I choose to react to all those things that I've just been talking about. But on the other hand, the God that becomes actual to me and that is a good thing for me, also we saw in one of my earlier videos that God is also, when we work through all the interrelations among the three persons, they all come out to be something self-caused, something that's dependent on nothing else except itself. So when we get into this situation, there's a sense in which, well, yes, we are both the cause and the effect of that. And God is both the cause and the effect of our passion, our decision to take God seriously and to respond with gratitude to what He has done. Whether we or God is the cause or the effect, it sort of can go either way. There's a kind of, I would want to say, healthy ambiguity there that's not a confusion, that's just the way the situation is. And so, to me, it seems that when we start to take this Kierkegaardian view seriously, and a lot more could be said about this, believe me, I know. But when we start to look at that and take it seriously, then I think that the Nietzschean critique kind of falls by the wayside. It doesn't really get a grip on that in the way that it gets a grip on Gelassenheit theology and Streit theology. So that's what I wanted to talk about this evening. Again, thank you for being very patient with me as I discuss these various ideas. I know that a lot of this is unusual and maybe it's a little even crazy, I don't know. But I find it interesting and I like sharing with you. And so if you take anything positive from that, I'm really happy to hear it. And even if you don't, still I'm appreciative of the fact that you spent time, been patient, and at least given me a fair hearing. So this is Katya. I wish everybody a good evening, and I promise in future videos I'll try to do some things that have more to do with cross-dressing and some other related content, but I didn't want to get that off my chest. So that's all for now. Until next time, this is Katya Eckhart, wishing everybody a restful and a peaceful evening. Bye-bye.